Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. I'm your host, Sucheta Kamath. Thank you for joining us today. I believe by tying the findings from neuroscience, psychology, education, anthropology, and so on and so forth into our daily transformations, there's a lot can be achieved, and particularly all that can feed our personal and collective growth. Research suggests that humans are social animals, and we are certainly wired to make connections. And without connections, we feel lost, we feel lonely, and we feel uninspired. Today, I thought just an appropriate story is there was a Colorado resident, Michael Kent, who was a former neo-Nazi who encountered an African-American parole officer. Her name was Tiffany Whittier, who not only connected with Michael openly and authentically, but she helped him see beyond the skin color and helped him change his views about white supremacy. And that led to this really unlikely and unusual friendship between the two, eventually, which brought him to the tattoo parlor to get him to remove the Nazi swastika from his body. He also made a lot of changes, and all that was made possible. The psychological change, a human change, and of course, a change that can really contribute to the society we create was made possible by two people who would have never found each other to be great companions. And they would have stayed strangers unless something transformed in their own situation that brought them together. And that's why it is such a joy today to invite Dr. Gillian Sandstrom, who is a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Essex. She studies the benefits of and barriers to having minimal social interactions with people like strangers, and something called weak ties, which we'll talk about, which is casually we can say acquaintances. She is an introvert herself. You can tell that once you get to know her. She's a brilliant communicator, but introvert, and she has grown to love talking to strangers. She shares her stories of talking to strangers on Twitter, at Gillian Social, which I hope you all check out. And most important thing she's going to talk to us about is the process and the benefits. They outnumber the fear that one may harbor in our hearts that strangers are something to be wary about. So welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Thanks so much for having me. It's my favorite thing to talk about. So.
Yes, and you talk so well about it. So let's dive in. So if humans are a social animal, why do we fear socializing through interactions with strangers? And aren't all acquaintances and known people strangers at some time, some point?
Right. And so I think that's why this research question has intrigued me so much. You know, I think there may be a couple of exceptions, but yeah, but basically everybody starts off as a stranger. And yet we're so afraid to talk to people, and we benefit so much when we do. So it's this puzzling conundrum that just never ceases to keep me interested. I've been interested specifically in what you asked, like why are people so worried about it? What do people think might happen if they were to talk to somebody? And
so
I guess
what is the fear associated with talking? Yeah,
I think the problem from a researcher's perspective, or just, from any of us trying to sort of fix this and encourage people to talk to each other, is just that there are so many things that people worry about. From worrying about the other person's reaction, are they going to reject me? Are are they going to be interested in talking to me? But also, we're worried that we're not going to enjoy it, that we might get bored. What's the point in talking to someone? Surely they have nothing interesting to say, but also maybe I don't have anything interesting to say and they're not going to like me. And we don't want to not be liked. That doesn't feel good. And I think people are just worried about not knowing what to say, the sort of mechanics of it. And I think, that's probably especially true right now after COVID, when we've all sort of withdrawn. We might feel like we've lost our skills if we feel like we ever had them, which maybe many people don't. But I believe, and my research finds, that it's easier than you think, and you know how to do this. So people are more worried than they need to be, is the sort of main takeaway of the research.
And I think, can we talk a little bit about this concept of judgment? I think I had Ethan Cross on my podcast who talks about mental chatter. And it's so interesting that we are so much in our head. And so the biggest person's voice that is really reverberating in our head is our own. So I don't even know when we have time to clear our voice to let other people's voices get in. But I can see one of the things your research also points out is there's so much drama that's happening about anticipation of how things can go wrong. They don't even need to go wrong. So all the creative ways we are thinking how we'll be rejected. So what is this concept of rejection or acceptance? Can we start there? And also, if you can talk about people who we know also reject and accept things we say, but we have a different relationship to that. And why is that relationship to rejection of an idea or not accepting what we are saying feels emotionally different?
Oof, that was a lot of questions, and really interesting ones. To start by your comment about Ethan's work on the sort of the voice that's always talking in the head, we definitely find the same thing, that people sort of get caught up in that negative voice. So it's not just that there's a voice in the head, but it's just a really negative voice. We're so unkind to ourselves. And we think after talking to a stranger, oh, they couldn't possibly have found me interesting or liked me. And we compare ourselves to maybe our best self, or we think about the time we told the story better, or why did I say that, or why didn't I say that? And so, yeah, we do get caught up in this voice. And like I said, this negative voice. I don't know. We just beat ourselves up. But yeah, the question about how it's different when it's people we know is really interesting. And so I've been teaching some how to talk to strangers workshops. That came from sort of thinking about how maybe one of the reasons people don't do this is because they just simply don't know how. And recently when I taught one of the workshops, someone asked a really good question, and they said, the kind of interactions with strangers that I've been looking at are kind of a special kind, because I've been looking at the kind of interactions that are sort of meant to just last for a moment and then you walk away. And I think there's something kind of extra special about those. And maybe they suit an introvert particularly well, because I can just have a brief conversation. I know I'm going to enjoy the moment, but then I can walk away and I know I'll never see the person again. And that reduces some of the fears about what's going to happen. Right. So, but this person who attended the workshop pointed out that those kind of interactions with strangers are very different than talking to a new colleague at work or something, where you're going to continue to have a relationship, or you might continue to see this person, and that can be even, people might worry even more about rejection, because if it's someone you walk away from, oh, well, if they don't want to talk, it's not a big deal. It's forgotten almost immediately. But if it's someone that you feel like maybe you want to develop a relationship with, or just, have a friendly working relationship with, then rejection is a lot more consequential, isn't it?
Yes. And I think like what's so funny about what you just said is how seriously we take rejection. Almost it becomes an identity. Like I am that person who's universally accepted at all times, never, ever rejected. And that's just such a false reality, right? If Absolutely. I'm in my head, and everybody else is too.
And the funny thing, one of the things that I think is kind of funny about talking to strangers and rejection in terms of talking to strangers is there's almost no consequence to it. For the first kind of stranger I'm talking about, right? The one where you just walk away. It doesn't really matter if someone doesn't want to talk to you. There's no cost to it except for that negative feeling that we kind of blow out of proportion. And so I think we can sort of maybe get used to that. Like, I think we just have to kind of put ourselves out there and keep trying and sort of learn that actually it's not that bad when it happens, which is rare in the first place. So from some of the data that I've collected, it seems like people are only rejected about less than 10% of the time. So it happens really infrequently. And, if you think about it, every interaction is about two people, right? So yes, maybe you have a role to play in this rejection. We could see it as something's wrong with me. They don't like me. They're afraid of me or whatever. But, we forget that there's a second person involved and, there's many reasons that they might not want to talk to you, right? They might be really stressed out about something or preoccupied or just really afraid of talking to people, right? They might be so socially anxious that they are afraid to talk to you. So we forget that person has their own issues and reasons for why they might not want to talk. But I was on the tube, I guess it's a while ago now because of COVID. But I started doing this research because I started talking to strangers and really enjoying it, and I wanted to understand it better. But now because I do this research, I talk to strangers even more because I feel like I have to walk the walk. If this is the research, I get to do my own sort of personal research. And so I was on the tube and I sort of try to convince myself to talk, not all the time, but, a lot of the time I'll try to talk to somebody. And so I remember this one time not that long ago where I turned to the person on my right and tried to start a conversation. And she was polite, but it was clear that she didn't really want to talk. I think she, plugged in her earphones or she pulled out her book or something. And I thought, all right. And so I turned to the left and I had a really nice chat with the person sitting on the other side. So I think we can get to the point where we can get used to the fact that it's not a big deal if someone doesn't want to talk. So rejection, I think we sort of blow it out of proportion and it feels like a bigger deal than it is in this situation. I mean, I'm not saying rejection isn't bad, but in this particular kind of talking to strangers situation, I just don't see the huge, it's just not as negative as we make it out to be.
And I think in your work, you write that simply by exposing ourselves to strangers, we can move from awkward, stage where we feel awkward to a stage where we have a curious and discovery mode, which kind of informs our perspective taking and help us build different viewpoints. So let's talk about how do you induce people to, how do you study this in a lab? How do you measure people's encounters with strangers? And also, if you may sorry, again, as you can see, a habit is emerging where I'm asking you too many questions at the same time. But maybe first, if you can just say, strangers, the concept that you will never meet that person again is, I come from India, and one of the things I had ample opportunity to encounter strangers was people I ride bus with, train with, people, if you are standing at the bus stop, people you encounter. If you go to the vegetable market, you have to deal with vendors. You're not talking to, you're not picking up your own groceries and going through, individual checkout. I feel like a lot of, at least in America, where I have spent most of my time, a lot of encounters with strangers are eliminated because we have removed the need to need strangers. A gas station, we want to pump. I will not go to self-serve gas station. I don't want to deal with anybody. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how did you think about these different ties, weak versus strong ties, and then how do you study this in a lab?
So I'm going to start in one place, and then if I don't answer all your questions, just ask me again, because I have a terrible.
I apologize.
But I think one of the first studies I ran during my PhD, I ran it at Starbucks, and this sort of came from the idea that I'm like, okay, back up a second. I developed a relationship with a lady who worked at a hot dog stand, and it made a huge difference to me feeling comfortable on campus when I started my master's degree. And so I really wanted to study that kind of interaction, which is kind of a baby step up from a stranger, because it was not somebody that I ever really talked to, that I knew well, but we had mutual recognition. So I consider that to be not strangers anymore. And I thought one kind of relationship like that is the relationship that people have with their favorite barista at the coffee shop. And so that's what I really wanted to study, was sort of, can that, how does having that person in our life make a difference to us? But I had a hard time figuring out how to study that. And so that's sort of how I ended up starting to look at conversations with strangers. So I ran a study at Starbucks where I approached people on the sidewalk outside of Starbucks. And I said, I will give you a gift card, and you have to spend it right now. And the only catch is that you have to follow some instructions when you go in. And so some people, we asked them to be as efficient as possible, to have their money ready and avoid chatting with the cashier. And we said, this is good because the person working there just wants to get on with their day, and you're helping them out by just being really efficient. And then other people, we said, when you go in and you buy your coffee, just try to turn it into a real social interaction. So smile, make eye contact, and have a little chat. And lots of people said, oh yeah, I do that all the time. And we said, okay, do it even more. And what we found is that when people came out of the store, if they'd had that little tiny conversation, they were in a better mood and they felt more connected to other people. And the research paper, in the title, we said something about efficiency. And it seems like this sort of, that we focus more and more on efficiency, and we could probably avoid talking. I don't know if you can avoid talking to people at Starbucks now, but you can avoid, at the fast food restaurant or the grocery store, like you're saying, at the gas station. You don't have to talk to people anymore. And I think we're tricking ourselves into the fact that this is more efficient. And so we're willing to make that trade-off, that we're willing to, not have these little social interactions because we want the added efficiency. Whereas if you think about it, at least in the Starbucks situation, it doesn't take any longer to get your coffee if you have a chat. It really doesn't. You have to wait for that coffee to be made. And so, it's this false trade-off, I think, that we're kind of throwing away an opportunity for happiness by focusing on being more efficient instead. And I think the risk is practice really does make perfect when it comes to talking to people. And so I think we're taking away all these opportunities
optimal interactions
to practice. Yeah. And that's not great. And I mean, technology is doing that in lots of ways, right? People will do this instead of, to tap on their phones instead of actually talking face to face. And that could also lead us to, we might not develop those skills, or we just might not feel as confident in them because we're not using them as often. So I know I haven't answered all your questions because I've forgotten the other part.
I think this, no, and I'll come back and I apologize. I think this is fantastic. I think the first point that hits home for me in that study is the impact on mood, and the people have completely left that out of equation. And you're right. I think, thank you for tying the concept of efficiency. We want to be productive. We want to be in spaces where most work will be so we can be done. And then we are looking at all the other things of our lives as auxiliary, unnecessary, not needed. Can we remove it? It's like, I want to put the trash in my bin and drag it down to the street, but never want to talk to the trash man, because that's going to
but the problem is
take my time away.
Sure. But then the problem is, of course, you're not going to enjoy it. Right. And I think we have an endless list. We have an endless to-do list. It literally is never going to end. And so I think, if we focus too much on trying to get things done instead of enjoying the moments as they come along, then we're kind of missing out on something. And I think most people, even people who are like, I never talk to strangers, I would bet most people can think of a time where they've inadvertently talked to someone, or someone has talked to them and they've been polite and talked back. and they felt better afterwards. Like I think we all recognize that we've had a situation like that where we've had a little tiny interaction and we're like, oh, actually I walked away feeling pretty good. And so I just want to tell people, look, that happens almost all the time. And you can actually do it on purpose to feel good and make the other person feel good, which is a really lovely thing as well, that it benefits both people. So.
And I do have a story actually that proves your research is absolutely on the money. Is, a couple of weeks ago, I was flying to New York, one of my first or second trips after the pandemic. And we had massive thunderstorm and lightning in Atlanta. And then we got stranded, and I had unfortunate circumstance of the middle seat. and so the plane half boarded and somebody on the left side had not entered the plane yet. But I know the plane was packed. And so what was supposed to be just, board the plane, everybody got their, devices, and I had downloaded a movie. I was ready to like rock and roll and not having to deal with anything. This is my time that I'd get to be uninterrupted, And then once we realized that, oh, this is serious. And so I had some earbuds, and then some announcement was made. So I missed it. So I had to go to my loose tie, the weak tie, and ask the guy next to me and said, I'm so sorry. What did they say? And so he gave me the scoop. And then that simple act of asking became now a relationship.
Now you're in
like
a conversation. Yeah.
Yes. And then I was, by the time like 2 hours we were on the plane, I'm borrowing his, his charger. He's giving me his pretzels, and I'm looking through my bag to see if I can reciprocate. We are talking about where we are going. And then this went on for 4 hours. And then not our conversation, but we being on the plane. Finally, they got us off, and they said the new team the crew could not, they couldn't find a new pilot, because the shift had ended. Complicated story short, I felt obliged to tell the man who I had never seen, probably never going to meet, to let him know that I was leaving and I was going to board the plane tomorrow. I mean, now I found myself that I have a relationship. Somehow there's one plane, one person at that airport that I had to inform that, hey, I'm not going to be boarding this plane to New York again, but I'm going to take the plane tomorrow. So it's just such a sweet thing. And I bet
that 4 hours felt like it went by a lot quicker because you had someone to talk to.
Absolutely.
And you probably didn't get stuck up in your head as much about, oh, this is so annoying, I can't believe this is happening, because you're talking to someone instead. So
100%. Yeah. How do you know? Yes. And I think the most beautiful thing, as you mentioned, is it gave me a perspective that there's so many people with me that are in the same predicament. So nothing special about my predicament. It is not extraordinary or bad. It's just what it is. So is this what you are also seeing? And tell us more about your other layers of research that you have done.
To answer the first part, I do think that you've tapped into something that I think is really important here. So, like I said earlier, I talk to strangers quite a bit, almost daily. I go for a walk in the park and I talk to people with the dogs, or I talk to people, who were coming out of their garden allotments and whatever. But I think, a lot of times a single conversation with a stranger is nothing special. It's average. It's fine. It's not negative. I think they're rarely actually negative, but a lot of times they're just kind of neutral or average. Every once in a while, you have a really interesting or stimulating or fun or, whatever conversation. But I think that one of the benefits, there are benefits from having a single interaction, but I think there's also this sort of benefit of accumulating a lot of interactions with strangers. And I think that that's what I value from it. I don't necessarily remember the conversations I have, which is partly why I put them on Twitter to sort of remind me of all these nice little moments that I've had, because they are forgotten quite quickly. But they add up to me feeling like I could talk to pretty much anybody, and people are generally kind of interesting and nice, and my world just feels a little safer and friendlier. And I think that's the biggest benefit to talking to strangers.
Lovely. So now that you have shared with us the initial your why you got into the field and your initial setup, in what ways you have furthered this investigation, and what have been the questions that you have tried to get answers to?
Right. So I guess I started by just trying to, like I mentioned, I had this relationship with the lady at the hot dog stand. And so the first question I had was, is it just me, or is this a thing? Do people in general have these kind of relationships that matter? And is it possible there's sort of this kind of relationship that maybe we're undervaluing, overlooking a little bit? And I kind of hope that COVID has made people realize that they have this whole network of people that don't feel important, but add up to something really important, add up to this feeling of belonging in our community and at work. And, in our, and I was going to say in our city, that's the same as community, whatever. So that's kind of
Yes.
where I started. And then because I found actually, yes, people do benefit from doing this. They feel better. They feel more connected. That sort of leads to the question that you asked really early on, which is, why do we not do it? So then I've spent quite a bit of time trying to understand, exactly what are people worried about, with the thinking that if I figure out sort of common things that most people worry about, maybe I can help fix them, like figure out ways to sort of break down the barriers and encourage people to talk so that they can enjoy these benefits. But I'm kind of feeling at the moment that it's a bit of a whack-a-mole situation. That game where the gopher head
Yes,
pops
very
up.
familiar with that.
If you hit one, then another one pops up in its place. So it kind of feels like people worry about so many different things that even if you're able to sort of reduce one of those fears, they'll just, think about another one. And so the most recent study that I did kind of stemmed from that, and just the fact that, so going back to one of your earlier questions about how do I study this? So I have run some lab studies. I also do a lot of field studies, but in the lab, I'll pair people up with a stranger. And sometimes that's a confederate, someone that I've provided for them to talk to. And sometimes it is just some other research participant, and I pair people up together. And I've also run studies where I just ask people to find someone and go up and talk to them sort of on the spot. But I had done some studies where, every study that I'd run, so dozens of them, I'd ask people to report before talking to a stranger how they were feeling, what they thought would happen. And then they would actually have a conversation and report back on how the conversation actually went. And every single time, people would say it was much more enjoyable than they expected. It's not like they're expecting it to be horrible, but it's just they're underestimating how well it's going to go. And they would have to kind of admit that all those things they worried about didn't actually happen. So we're talking massive effect sizes here, like huge differences between the predictions and the reality. But
Wow.
People didn't seem to be learning from this. So if you ask them what's going to happen if you talk to another stranger, they're like, ooh, I don't know. And so I think it's just really hard for us to generalize because we see every person as unique. So just because I had a nice conversation with Sucheta, why would I think I would have a nice conversation with Evie? I don't know her. She's totally different. Anything could happen. And so again, that negative voice comes in and we think, I don't know. And it's kind of silly, right? Because, we're a common denominator in both of those things. So we have some influence over how the conversation goes. And also, like you said at the beginning, I mean, every person we know started as a stranger. So clearly we've had quite a lot of experience in our lifetime of talking to strangers, but I think we don't do it very often. And so I think, we don't notice the patterns. And so I thought, okay, how do I deal with this? How can I fix this? And so the most recent study that I've done was a study where I thought I need people to have multiple conversations with strangers in a short period of time so that they can see that these conversations just generally go well every single time. And that seemed like a really hard thing to do because people don't want to talk to strangers. So how am I going to convince people to talk to lots of strangers when they don't want to talk to even one? And so what I did with some wonderful collaborators is we created a scavenger hunt game using an app. And so we had different missions for people to carry out. And they involved things like find someone who's wearing a hat or find someone who's drinking a coffee. And so people in the experimental condition had to find someone who matched the description and actually talk to them. And we had a control condition where people found the person and observed them, but didn't actually talk to them. And so we asked people to talk to at least one new person every day for 5 days. And what we found is that by the end of the week, people were just feeling a lot more confident. They were less worried about being rejected, so like more accurate about how often they would be rejected because, like I said, people are rarely rejected. And they felt more able to carry on a conversation. So they were, more accurate about how well they'd be able to do that as well. So it seems like practice does make perfect. But like I said, we kind of have to, a lot of people probably need to push themselves to have that practice so that they can learn that actually these kind of conversations generally go well. Don't write off that one nice conversation as an exception. It is the rule, not an exception.
Well, first of all, I love your experimental design. I think just you had to be so clever to think differently about compensating for these nuance-based difficulties to make it a natural encounter, yet facilitate multiple happenings. So very clever.
I think people enjoyed it, that it was a game. It was sort of a challenge rather than a threat, and it was kind of fun. And I think that's why people kind of stuck with it. So. Yes,
and I'll tell you one of the best advice I got from a very wise person that I have interacted with and met, and he said, when you are at a large gathering, talk to the person who nobody is talking to, and that has really helped me because a lot of times we go into social situations like a wedding or it's a reception or it's a conference, and we know just a few people, but then we also want to be so secure that we want to just be with them so that there's like a sense of relief. But also I think some people are extroverts and they get better attention. They know how to engage other people, and introverts may be absolutely fascinating people like yourself. And so you are self-proclaimed introvert. And I think that gem I discovered because I appear extrovert, even though I love to be by myself, which is hard for people to believe because I can talk to strangers. I can talk to people. I can make people talk, just a professional practice, The question, I know I tend to ask you too many questions, so I'm going to be very careful. One thing that stuck out for me is this interesting thing, as you explained in the design of your study and your findings, a story comes to mind of Mr. Rogers. So one of his producers tells this story. It's a really endearing story, but he had hired, the producer had hired a crew, and they were going into New York City studio, and they had to walk from one place to another. And all the production team was on the clock, and he wanted to be very proficient. And they went through an alley, and then there was a homeless man sitting on the floor there. And he shouted out at these group of people who were walking by, "Hey, do you have $1?" And nobody turned around except Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Rogers then not only opened his wallet, found a $5 bill, but went to that homeless man and sat next to him. Gave the $5 bill. Now here, the producer is getting a heartache. He's like getting a little heart attack. Come on. Like Mr. Rogers means 20 minutes gone for sure. But Mr. Rogers actually, and he wasn't trying to impress. He wasn't trying to do anything. He just could not pass in a non-personal way, this bill and move on. He had to stop by, talk, just kind of visit. And I just found so much inspiration in that story that I think visiting people, seeing them for who they are and maybe revealing a little bit of yourself is what your invitation is to all of us. Is the strangers are in a way one of the best friends that you haven't discovered yet, So that's such a joy. And so with that in mind, I think there are three components you often describe, which is that there's an affective component, there's a social component, and then there's a competence component. So can we talk a little bit about the competence component of communication? So when I'm a speech and language pathologist, I have been for 25 years, and my field of expertise is teaching and empowering people with something called pragmatics, this social cognition, this capacity to communicate, connect, and make meaningful language and nonverbal communication with people. And I find that sometimes people with in ADHD or Asperger's or language-based learning disability actually have deficits in this competence of using knowledge based how language and communication works. Have you explored that, or have you given a thought as to how that piece fits when somebody is less competent? Then they have reasons to not feel confident. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to push pause on that for 1 second to go back to your story about talking at a party. Because as a fellow introvert, like that is the number one situation that I hate. I hate being in a room full of people when it's loud, and I find that very overwhelming. And I don't know, I don't feel like someone wise gave me that advice, but I somehow figured out the same thing that you're talking about, that it makes me feel better to find one person to talk to. I almost feel like finding a person to talk to is a coping mechanism for me now. I think like if I talk to someone on the tube is also like really noisy and smelly and loud. And if I turn to someone and have a conversation with them, that helps me block out all the other stuff. And so I do exactly what you're describing. I'll look around the room and try to find someone who's not talking and go up and talk to them and have a one-on-one conversation, because that's what's comfortable for me. And partly, one of the things that I'll sometimes do to sort of work up my nerve to do it, because even after having talked to thousands of strangers, I still, get a little anxious sometimes, even though I know I'm going to be fine, even though I know I'm going to enjoy it, there's still that little bit of fear. And so in that particular situation, I will try to tell myself that I'm doing it for that person. They have no one to talk to. They're going to appreciate me talking to them. It's an act of kindness. It's a pro-social thing for me to go up and talk to that person. And that's sometimes enough to make me feel up to doing it. So I think that's one thing that I'm trying to emphasize when I talk to people is talking to strangers benefits you because it helps put you in a good mood and makes you feel connected to other people. But it also benefits the person you talk to. And so it's a win-win for everyone. But sorry, back to the question, which I've actually remembered for once. I haven't looked at any special populations that might have more difficulty communicating, but I guess I have been starting to think about sort of what the baby steps might be to work up to talking to strangers. So I know that it might be just impossibly scary for some people. And so I think there are some steps that you can take to sort of work up to it. So for myself, I think the first step just involved making eye contact with people. I realized that I would look at people and then it felt too scary and I would look at the sidewalk afterwards. And so I really had to train myself to sort of maintain eye contact with people. And that led people to talk to me because it was so unusual to have someone look at them that they thought, oh, she's safe to talk to because she looked me in the eye. And so then it was a passive, I will talk to strangers who talk to me. And eventually I was the one initiating. So I think eye contact is the first thing. I think, and there's research showing that simply making eye contact with someone makes the other person feel less disconnected. I use
Wow.
that was how it was described in the study, less disconnected. So I always say that rather than more connected, but even though it sounds awkward.
It's very
So
powerful.
I think eye contact is the first step. And then you can just smile at people. And I always nod at the same time. So that's my pro tip. Because I think if you just smile, people don't know that you're smiling at them. They might just think you're just a smiley person and you always walk around smiling. So I'll smile and nod my head at someone so that they know that that smile is directed at them. And I will do this. I do a little thing when I go on the tube. I go, you go down this escalator down into the depths, and I'll often
listeners. I just want to kind of interject and say, Gillian is in Essex, so England. So you're wondering her accent, but she's Canadian. And the tube, of course, refers to, we have people from 110 countries, by the way. Sorry, 120 countries listening to us. So yes, I'm sure many know, but Americans may not know what tube is. Sorry, go ahead.
So as I go down the escalator, down to the tube or the subway, I'll often play a little game with myself where I try to get people who are going the opposite direction to smile at me. So I just try to make eye contact and smile at someone. It's a good little practice because you literally can't, like, there's no strings because you're going opposite directions. It's literally a few seconds and there's nothing to worry about. And it's really hard. And it reminds me how often we're distracted. We're not looking at people. We're, on our phones, or we're looking, it almost seems like people are afraid to look at each other these days. And so I consider it a small triumph every time I can get someone to smile back at me. So I think smiling and nodding is sort of maybe the next step up. And then you could just say hi with no actual conversation. And then I think,
say hi.
And then I think there's certain people that are easier to talk to. So if someone wanted to sort of work their way up to, approaching a random person, you can practice in situations that are especially safe. And so I think that's one of the things about a place like Starbucks. The people who work there are trained to talk to you if you want to talk. So they're never going to reject you. It's going to be a very short period of time and you can walk away. I've come across advice at different points about talking to people in an elevator or in the lift for the same reasons, that that there's a very short period of time and then you're going to walk away. And so it's not as scary because everything is sort of defined, what to expect. So you can seek out those kind of situations that to get some practice in a safe way before you go rogue and talk to random people on the tube.
I love this. I think you just kind of described the little tiny hacks of, conquering your own fears and setting the stage for stepping forward to even have the courage to say something. Can I share something? When I grew up in India, we have a custom, very unlike how it happens here. People knock on your door and come to visit without announcing. And that used to be a very common thing. We lived in what in here you would describe it as a subdivision, and we lock the doors. The door may be even flung open all the time. But anyways, in my family, the rule was children would go and greet whoever is at the door. And 50% chance that there's a stranger there, and 50% it would be an acquaintance, somebody in the neighborhood, or actually friends. And it used to be very annoying. Like, I remember distinctly getting annoyed with my parents for this rule, because you had to pretend to be just smile. Oh, hello, how are you? And I just want to kind of put a dagger in your heart. But, and so I had this internal duality as an adolescent, feeling extremely uncomfortable. And I felt that my parents were pawning off this job that it was theirs, Anyways, that proved to be such a helpful life lesson, actually, that not only you say hello, you ask them why they're there, you invite them if that's appropriate, and offer them water or tea or coffee. So that would be the job. And then you go go to the chambers and invite the kings and queens, which is not how it was. But my parents required all three siblings, all three of us to do that. That really helped, because when I came to US, I remember my first month, I got into an elevator with a big grin on my face, no reason. This was before cell phones. And the man in the elevator says to me, "What are you laughing about?" And I said, "Nothing." But anyways, so I am often, I have inculcated or habitated that stance, and that has proven to be very effective. So my question is, one disadvantage I have experienced because of this is people think I'm very friendly. So I get approached all the time for directions. And when I was younger, in quotes, less popular group would love to hang out with me because I was presenting myself and genuinely maybe also meaning to be inclusive. But that was annoying because then I was taken away from popular people, not the elitist of the elite. Do you have any thoughts about the social capital, this capacity to withhold your approachability that sometimes people think that somehow makes them special?
I don't quite know how to answer that question. But what I will say is, I talk a lot about the benefits that I've talked about so far from talking to strangers are the sort of emotional, psychological benefits. But you get actual tangible benefits as well. So and I wouldn't want to recommend this to anybody, but I have had a lift, someone has offered me a ride. My husband was with me, so it didn't seem that scary. It was the kindest thing because it saved us, an hour of time when it was really late and we were really tired. I have recently, I walked past a garden allotment, and this lady said, "Would you like some zucchini, some courgette?" I said, "Sure." So I got free vegetables. I've, learned really interesting things from other people. My husband got an interview at a company because I started a conversation with a stranger by almost sitting on his coffee. So my point is, I think one of the downsides of networking is that it feels very instrumental, and it feels to many of us kind of icky. Like we're doing it for a purpose because we want to get something from people. And I don't want to advocate talking to strangers for the reason that you think you'll get things from people. But I think when you don't try to get things from people, it still happens because people appreciate that feeling of connection, and that's what drives people to want to do things for you. And so I think that there are all kinds of tangible benefits and social capital benefits that come from just socializing rather than, trying to get something from people.
And, I think as we come to the end of this discussion, this is such a powerful message because the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children are now encouraging parents to kind of stay away from using the term stranger danger, which was popularized in 80s, almost when kidnapping and a national database was created and television started not advertising, but programming that would talk about missing children. But what they are finding, the data actually doesn't show at all. And this training, which is, be stern, don't stop, don't engage, they are even noticing that kind of advice has no merit. And I feel that the culture also has imbibed that feeling. If children are not safe, then adults, maybe we are in the same predicament. But the general attitude towards strangers is danger. So as we end our conversation, two thoughts, maybe two comments. One is, what would you like us, the listeners, to think about when they think about talking to children about building a set of skills or relationships with strangers? And I know that's not your wheelhouse of research, but I'm sure there's so much applicability because I think these are parents who may not be demonstrating how they talk to strangers. So then you can't have rules that are separate for your children if you're not doing it. So that was my first question. Yeah,
I feel like the change in that message, the fact that people we don't want to pump up the whole stranger danger thing anymore, feels important. And I think, this thinking about strangers as being dangerous could almost cause its own set of problems, because if something bad did happen, if we're too scared to ask for help, then that's a negative thing as well. Right. And so one thing I found, as I've built up skills in talking to strangers, which has been a sort of gradual thing, it translates in other ways, right? Like I think by feeling more comfortable in that kind of situation, I also feel more confident to put up my hand and ask a question in a room full of people. Or I feel more comfortable when I have to make a phone call and book an appointment or something. I hated that as a kid. When my mom would make me call up whoever and I always felt like afterwards she'd say, did you say this? Did you say that? And I'm like, well, why didn't you tell me I was supposed to do those things? I just felt so anxious on the phone talking to someone that I just absolutely hated it. I mean, we don't do that so often these days, but it's made those kind of situations more comfortable. It's made me more comfortable to ask for help from other people. So I think, by telling children you can't talk to strangers, that we're cutting them off from all these opportunities to practice. So, there's a kernel of there's something truthful about stranger danger, right? Like I'm not trying to advocate that people should talk to someone when they're walking down a dark alley. But I guess the point is, kids should feel safe to talk to strangers in many situations. And I think that will help them develop skills that will be useful in all sorts of different domains.
I think that's a really important and valuable message there, Gillian, that parents are cutting off these opportunities that build skills. Such a powerful way to think about the relationship with the world. So the last question about this big topic of strangers is social media. And, I was reading some work by an anthropologist from 80s, and he was giving a longitudinal studies about not studies, but how tribes and how we lived in tribes. A human would, I think maybe turn of a century, like 19th or 20th century, up to then, we met 150 people over a lifespan. Strangers, 150 only. And now we are getting comments from 150 strangers a week, right? And
I remember reading Pride and Prejudice, and the mother gets really worked up and she says, I'll have you know, we dine with 13 families. And I thought that's someone's entire social world is 13 families.
Oh, I love that.
I'm making up that number. I'm terrible at remembering numbers. But
I exactly remember that. Yes. I mean, it's like really when you're trying to make an impact, or reputation management was all about the number of people you would encounter for a lifetime. And now, I feel that's like a leaky dike. You have, like you said, Twitter or Instagram and Facebook, and so many people are getting to know your thoughts, and they may be quietly consuming them or observing them. Or you're also subjected to comments by people who will never, ever take the time to look into your eyes and see the pain that one might feel if they said something nasty. So what are your thoughts about this extremism in stranger encounters?
I mean, I don't want to be the person who says social media is terrible and causing all these problems, because there's so many really nice things about social networks, especially for people who feel who don't have people around them who share their experiences. You can find people, you can connect with so many more people who might sort of get you and be able to provide the support that you need. So, there's lots of really good things about it. But of course, I think we just need to be aware of the pluses and minuses. And so, there's research about how happy people tend to compare themselves less often to others. And we know that social media is like the worst for comparing yourself, right? That's what we do most of the time is people self-present, they present this perfect life. And then we look at everyone and we think, oh, my life is no good in comparison. So I think we have to be aware of what the issues are. And people posting things in the hopes of getting lots of likes and maybe deleting something if it didn't get enough likes. I'm just going to say it straight up. That's not a way to live. You're not living to make other people happy. You should be living in a way that is meaningful to you and makes you happy. So,
it's a perfect. I think that's such a pragmatic and genuinely, I think, effective message. So as we come to end of this interview, you've been fantastic. Can you share some books that are top of the mind for you that you found useful?
Sure. So the first one is a new book called The Power of Strangers. Oh gosh, I don't even know what it's called. The Power of Strangers. Oh, good. I got it right. By someone named Joe Cohane. And I'm a little biased in this recommendation because I talked to Joe a couple times, and chapter 2 is all about my research.
Yes.
But nonetheless, it is a really great book. He talks a lot about why we should talk to strangers, like what are some of the benefits that we get from it, including sort of societal level benefits, which I sort of touched upon a little bit, and also a little bit in how to do it. And he shares all sorts of stories about different people that he encountered who were talking to various strangers. He did a cross-country train ride where he talked to lots of people. And he's just really funny. So my advice to anybody who picks up this book is don't skip the footnotes. The footnotes are the funniest bits.
Oh, that's great. Oh, that's lovely. Yes.
And then I'm quite a reader, which is probably maybe not surprising for an introvert. But my favorite novel that I've read recently, I was kind of late to this book, but it's called A Gentleman in Moscow. Have you read it?
Yes.
I love that book so much. And even just thinking about the ending makes me cry. So I'm not going to do that. But I think, so the premise of the book is that we have an aristocrat, a member of the nobility, who is confined to a hotel for the rest of his life. And he's told if he leaves the hotel, he will be shot. And so I think the thing that really appealed to me is, in one way, his world is very, like, physically quite small, right? He's restricted to one building. And yet he really manages to lead a life that's rich in meaning and relationships. Like he treats every single person with courtesy and respect. And he's just developed these kind of deep, maybe surprising friendships that he would never have had if these circumstances hadn't intervened. And I just think it's a really, there was lots of things I liked about the book, but I just love that he managed to lead this super rich life, even given this huge constraint on his freedom. So that really appealed to me.
Love those recommendations. And definitely, it's so funny. Michael Lewis is one of my favorite authors, who has written Moneyball and many other books. And so that's his favorite book. So I heard him last year during the pandemic, a podcast interview, and he had recommended that book. So that's how I got exposed to it.
It's a perfect pandemic book, isn't it?
That's
because it's all about being locked in.
And how, anyways, I think it's just a very powerful book. Well, Gillian, what a fantastic, conversation, and thank you for opening up your brilliant mind. And sharing your wisdom. Folks, as you're listening, thank you again for joining us here. As you can see, these are very important conversations, informative and powerful, that can help us to propel ourselves to become better people. And maybe in your company, listeners, somebody would approach you as a stranger, and you will offer them the comfort that they deserve to reduce their concerns and worries by being very open to those conversations. So definitely keep staying in touch. If you love what you're listening, share with your friends, family, and colleagues. Like us on Full Prefrontal on our social media channel. And leave us a review. And if you need to reach out to me, you can always do so by emailing me at Sucheta, Sucheta at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. And thank you, Gillian, for being here, and hope to stay in touch.
Thank you so much for having me today and letting me talk about my favorite thing.
It's been great.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.